Could you, start recording as well? So welcome all of you. This is our second table of the International Symposium. So Plato today is really today and tomorrow and in the day after. So it will go from Monday until Wednesday. This is our second table and I'm going to be the chair of this session. I'm very happy to be here. Antonio just shared the presentations and handouts in the drive. And just to make clear, this is how it will go. So Professor Luca Pitteloud is going to present first. He has between 30 to 40 minutes to present. Then there will be a commentary by Sam, and then Professor Pitteloud can give a reply. And then we will have some time for discussion, a Q&A that's supposed to last for 1 hour and a half. Then Professor Fierro will take over the floor, and she has 30 to 40 minutes to present. Then a response will be followed by Cássio. Then she has the opportunity to respond to the commentary, and then we'll have a Q&A. And the table should last for about 3 hours and something. So without further ado, I'll begin. I will first present our speakers of this first round. So Professor Luca Pitteloud. Luca Pitteloud is a professor of philosophy at the Universidade Federal do ABC in Brazil, the Federal University of the ABC in Brazil, as well as the graduate programs in philosophy at the Federal University of Pará and the Metaphysics graduate program at the University of Brasilia. His research interests includes Neoplatonism, Hellenistic philosophy, Plato and Aristotle. And in 2017, he published La séparation de la métaphysique de Platon. Then Sam will give his commentary. I'll read his mini biography. Samuel Yelton is a PhD candidate in philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. His research interests include ancient and modern aesthetics, political philosophy, and Platonic psychology and ethics. He's currently writing his dissertation on the relationship between poetry and political identity in the Aeon and the Republic. So, Professor Pitteloud, the floor is yours. And the title of his talk is The Timaeus as a Thought Experiment.
Thank you very much, Pedro. I suppose everything you can hear me well. I hope if there is any problem, you can tell me. I'm very happy, of course, to be here. I want to thank the organizer, Antonio, Luis Eduardo, and Pedro, to greet all the people I can see the friendly and known faces here on Zoom. I'm going to give my talk. I'm going to talk freely, so it should last like, as we say, between 30 and 40 minutes, but I can stop if I'm too long. As I said, there is no paper. There is a handout. Actually, my paper is here. So if you see me sometimes looking on my left-hand side, it's not. I don't want to face the camera, but just that I'm reading some of my ideas. So I'm especially happy to be part of a conference called Plato Today, which aims. Seems to be the case to see that if Plato's philosophy has still today some importance for philosophical researches and studies. And I must say that the thesis I'm going to explain a little bit in this talk is part of a bigger project. So I'm going to sum up a few ideas, a few arguments, also a few objections that I address to myself. I'm especially looking forward to the commentary and then to the discussion. Of course, the idea to say that the Timaeus is a thought experiment needs a little bit of explaining, I suppose. The point of departure, you could say, is the idea that when you look at Timaeus' speech in the Timaeus, so the speech or the discourse about the coming to be of the universe, you are struck by two different things. I mean, at least I am. One is a very rigorous series of deduction or argument. You can call it the finalist deduction of the property of the universe. But that is not all. You also have something different at the same time, which is what I will explain that a little bit later, but a kind of visualization of the universe. That is, we at some point imagine what the universe looks like, and I'm going to go to more details about that in a little bit. And those two aspects actually seems to me that could be associated to a tool that it is very much used in contemporary philosophy. Of course, it's a very old tool, but it's still a subject of a lot of discussion, which is called, as you might imagine, thought experiment. So the idea is to try to defend that Timaeus' speech at the wall, that's important, can be a thought experiment. I will give you some definition and some criteria a little bit later, but that's the general idea. Just a few points before going into more details. The first point, of course, is that this thesis I'm trying to defend has some consequences about two important things which are currently discussed a lot about the Timaeus. And the first thing is the status of the demiurge. So who is the demiurge? Just to say it very, very quickly, you might know that there are different opinions and very strong opinion about the status of the demiurge. For some people, the demiurge is the demiurge, that is a divine craftsman who created or organized the world. But for some people, since Xenocrates, the demiurge can be or must be understood as a kind of tool which would help us to understand the universe from a didactical point of view. Of course, it's called the didactic approach of the Timaeus. And in this approach, you have different positions about the demiurge. The demiurge can be still a principle, a nous, an intellect in the universe, doing some work. That's a possibility. Or another possibility, the demiurge can be, let's call that the reductionist view, reduced to some other principle of the universe or thing in the universe. For example, the model, the intelligible forms. It can be the form of the good. It can be the active act of thinking of the model, etc. Or for some other people, the demiurge can be identified to another intellect, which we find in the universe, namely the world soul. All that, of course, as a subject of discussion and debate. But I just want to say that, of course, defending that the Timaeus is a thought experiment, Timaeus discourse, has, of course, some consequences about that, of which I will try to explain. And I think another methodological point which is important is that, at least in my mind, the question of the demiurge, of the status of the demiurge, is related to the status of the discourse, the myth, the likely story or the likely account that Timaeus is giving us. And why I'm saying that, because, you know, all these texts are very well known, so I'm not going to bore you with all of them, but as you all know, probably, the beginning of Timaeus' speech starts with some premises which are explained or at least introduce the distinction between the sensible and the intelligible, the idea that becoming needs a cause. And then a third one, which is a lot discussed, where Timaeus identified this cause of the beginning to a demiurge looking at a model which must be intelligible. And of course, almost everyone thinks that the introduction of the demiurge at that point in the premises of the Timaeus speech is a little bit strange, because of course, when I say of course, maybe I'm not completely neutral there, but you would expect some other candidates to be the cause of the sensible if you are a Platonist, and one which appear likely would be the forms and so the model. And that is not completely absurd to say, because in the second part of the Timaeus, the forms, we are talking about the forms of the four elements, are called, in a metaphorical way, of course, to be the father of the universe, where the receptacle is the mother and the universe is the child. So it's a little bit puzzling that there is this introduction of the demiurge as a cause of the universe. And of course, I think what I wanted to say with my point before is that it is because we introduce the demiurge as the father of the craftsman of the universe that, of course, we are going to have a story about the coming to be in time of the universe. So I just sum up very important problems about which I'm sure lots of you have a lot of opinions and arguments about that. But just to give a little bit the context. Two more points, and then I move to the question of thought experiment. It is true that, just to remind you, that the demiurge is said to be the best of the causes in 29a 5-6, and also that it is hard to find the maker of the universe and impossible to communicate, to talk about him to everybody. And finally, another affirmation which is important, again, that you all know, is that when Timaeus is saying that his speech is going to be about the universe, is going to give up the universe, will not have the certainty of what we might call sciences, but will be only, as he said, an ἐικός mythos. And as you know, there are a lot of discussion about what does it mean. Just, and I will talk about that a little bit later, but just a point which I think is important, that is, when Timaeus says his discourses is going to be a likely story or likely myth, whatever you want to call it, he's saying explicitly that it's going to be about the gods and the coming to be of the universe. So that was some general comments. Now I'm going into my argument. So what I want to defend in this loud project, and I'm giving some summary here, is the idea that actually the likely myth of Timaeus can be identified to a thought experiment. Just to specify my argument, what is the thought experiment of the Timaeus? It is namely, what should I do if I were to be the craftsman of the universe? Or, that is, in the Timaeus, we are put in the position to be the craftsmen of the universe, to fabricate the universe. We follow, so to speak, the demiurge footsteps or thoughts, or to use a vocabulary which is closer to the idea of thought experiment. We are supposed to create ourselves, the reader or Timaeus interlocutors, to create the universe inside the laboratory of our mind. That's the idea. And just a point which is important about that, you can find actually since the antiquity the idea that in the second part of the Timaeus, when Timaeus described the pre-cosmic chaos, so what was there before the demiurge started his work, you have some people who identify that to a thought experiment. So what is a thought experiment in this sense? I think someone is knocking, but I just ignored. Oh, I'm sorry, there's someone at the window with that. Excellent. Sorry about that. You know, it's these people who are cleaning the window. I hope it won't make too much noise. So that's a kind of first time it happened. I go back to my argument. So I was saying that for a lot of people, you can find the idea that what was the pre-cosmic, what is a pre-cosmic chaos is a kind of counterfactual scenario of what would be the universe without intelligibility. So in that sense, of course, not if you are a literalist, but in that sense, if you think that you take away into a counterfactual scenario the work of the demiurge and intelligible on the universe, you would be left with that. And I'm saying that because you will find some people defending that the pre-cosmic chaos is a kind of counterfactual scenario. What I want to say for my point is that I'm saying that it is, of course, for me also a counterfactual scenario, but it's part of the thought experiment of the Timaeus. So the thought experiment does not resume itself to the pre-cosmic chaos, but it is part of it. Also, if you put yourself in the footsteps of the demiurge, of course, you have to look first at what you are going to take and to organize, to make, or to fabricate the universe. And that's a part of the thought experiment. So now I can give you a few criteria and a definition about a thought experiment, because I haven't done that yet, and it is kind of important. So unfortunately, there is no, unfortunately, I don't know if it's unfortunate, but there is no consensus about what is a thought experiment. In general, I will read the criteria in a bit that people agree about thought experiment, but I just want to say that in a very general way, a thought experiment is a kind of experiment you are doing in your mind. It involves a counterfactual scenario, and you use it to prove something. I'll give some detail of that in a bit, but just to give an important point is that you can find two opposite strong views on thought experiment. And the first one is called the argument view, which defends that actually thought experiments are nothing else than arguments in disguise. You know, you use a history, but you can translate, or you could, according to this view, translate any thought experiment into an argument, deductive or non-deductive argument. So it's kind of a negative view on thought experiment. Thought experiment actually would be, to use something which is also important for the Timaeus discourse, a kind of didactical tool. And on the other side, you have it's called intuition-based account, or sometimes the Platonic account. And this is the idea that with thought experiment, you can prove some things, you can demonstrate something that you could not only with argument. That is that thought experiment will bring you something new, a new knowledge, a new piece of information about whatever you are doing your thought experiment in. It can be in ethics, in politics, in metaphysics, that you could not have reached only with the use of argument. That's two extreme view, obviously. And I'm quoting here another view, which I think very interesting, and the one I kind of defend about the Timaeus, which is the mental model view on thought experiment. I read, you have a lot of definition about that, but I read here just one definition. It's the text one on the handouts. Typical example of model mentals are involved in understanding stories or in ordinary planning of activities. When a reader encounters a description of a situation, she builds a model, a quasi-spatial picture of it. As new details are supplied by the storyteller, the model becomes updated. The idea that you have here in this account is that you've got your arguments that you use, you know, in any kind of part of philosophy you are doing, and you can put the argument together. The argument would be a kind of furniture in a room, and you can put them into different ways. There are different ways of combination of the arguments, and according to this combination, you would get a kind of new knowledge that you could not just by having a kind of linear view of those arguments, the one after the other. So that's why it's using the concept of quasi-spatial. And of course, you might think, how can someone defend that that's going on in the Timaeus? Well, that's what I'm going to try to do in the next minute. Just then you have some criteria about thought experiment. As I said, nobody agrees. So I've adopted some criteria, which I think are more or less not too polemical. The first one is thought experiment must always involve a counterfactual scenario. So you need to use your imagination, or to put it more in a Platonic way, to produce an image. The second criteria is the thought experiment should not be transposable into an argument. So that's actually the strong view on thought experiment, because people who defend the argument view on thought experiment do not agree, obviously, with this criteria. The idea that I want to defend also in this project is that actually you can get some new pieces of knowledge using the thought experiment that you could not only with the argument. And the third, of course, criteria is thought experiment must allow cognitive process. You should learn something new. If not, there is absolutely no interest. So bearing in mind those criteria, I'm going now to talk about the Timaeus. and Timaeus discourses. I'm just looking at the time. Can I have a kind of still have like 15, 20?
Yeah, 16 minutes have gone by since the beginning. So yeah, I have 20 minutes.
Excellent.
4
Thanks.
minutes, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I live beside a part which tries to show that we can find thought experiments in Plato. You know, there are different ones from Gyges to for some people, the statesman myth, and even you might say, again, I'm not going to defend that here, but the Atlantis story in the Timaeus, so before Timaeus' speech. But what I want to say now in a very specific way is that why the idea that Timaeus' speech could be a thought experiment. So first of all, I said it before, you have in the Timaeus some arguments, but you have a strong use of imagination, and you are put in the position to produce images of the universe in your mind. Two, you don't have a lot of experiment, let's say empirical experiment in the Timaeus. I'm not giving you the detail, but you have three actually in the text of the Timaeus. And then, and that's text number 3 on the handout. So I don't know if you could just put it a little higher. Excellent. I just read this very famous passage, but any attempt to put these matters through a practical test. So here we are talking about the question of colors and you know, checking the number of combination you can find in sensible appearances of the world. To a practical test would argue ignorance of the difference between human nature and divine, namely that divinity has knowledge and power sufficient to blend the many into one and to resolve the one into many. But no man is now or ever will be equal to either task. So it's a bit complicated to be sure about what this passage is. Probably an allusion about, I think, participation, and we have a similar you know, passage in the Phaedrus, which is very close to that. The idea that, you know, mixing the one and the many is what's happening in the process of participation. And what I would like to say now, to enter into some argument and some details, is precisely that. That is what we are going to do in the Timaeus experiment is trying, and of course it's not very easy for us, almost impossible, or depends if we are the friends of the gods, but to resolve the question of participation. That is how the many participate to the forms, but from a different perspective, and this perspective is an experiment of trying to copy a model, the intelligibility of a model, some properties of this model, into the becoming, into the sensible world. And to do in a narrative way, so with the before and an after. But we have to be, and really this is an important point, we have to know that this is not completely possible, I think, for us to do it. And again, everyone talks about the fact that this is a likely myth, and that we should keep in mind, because Timaeus is saying that at the beginning of his speech, but he's reminding that in a lot of places of the Timaeus. And so I just want kind of remind myself that it should never be treated as a kind of treaty of cosmology where we can be very positive. We should always be very cautious about what we say, because I think we are reaching the limits of our cognitive abilities. And that's why, in some sense, the idea of making a thought experiment also helps us to keep in mind those limits. So now let me being a bit more precise about what is exactly the counterfactual dimension of the Timaeus thought experiment. And to put it in a very broadly way, I think what is counterfactual in the Timaeus speech is namely what cannot be accessed by sensation or experience, sensitive experience. And so I would like to defend that in two specific moments of Timaeus' speech, which is actually the demiurge works. So what the demiurge is doing, and not, and that's an objection I probably will have, but I'm very interested to talk about that, and not what the young gods are making after the demiurge. So to put it bluntly, I limit myself to being in the mind of the demiurge. And if I have time, I will give some elements why I do that. And so you have two aspects which are really counterfactual in that sense. One, which we could call the macrocosmic constitution of the universe, where you see the universe from outside, so to speak, as a god. So that is when you see what's the body of the universe. You know, when we talk about the pre-cosmic chaos, it is very striking that the Timaeus said that those three elements, the traces you find in the pre-cosmic chaos, they can be seen, he's saying, but who can see them? No one can see them. There is no one, I mean, no one was still created, and the demiurge probably cannot see the traces because maybe the demiurge is a nous, but probably not, does not have organs. So, of course, my answer is that it's us as reader who can see, who can visualize, who can imagine those pre-cosmic chaos. So that's a dimension which cannot be checked by any kind of empirical experience. What is, for example, the shape of the universe from outside? Does the universe have organs and so on? You know, all the arguments were going to be developed in the Timaeus. And the other aspect, which is counterfactual, at least for Plato, is the microcosm. That is something you cannot check with any kind of experiment. That is precisely the constitution of the element with two basic triangles. And just now, because I've been very general in some ways, so just to take now two specific arguments to illustrate my points, but there would be much more, but just to be a little bit more precise. One argument which is very much discussed on the Timaeus is the question of the unity of the universe, and it is the next text on the handout. There is an argument which is summed up as text or argument number 4. So we are in the mind of the demiurge. We are kind of witness of how the demiurge think, and how does he think about this specific argument. The demiurge thinks, well, the model of the universe, the living animal, is unique. Then he thinks, second premise, if a model is unique, then its image must be unique in order to resemble its model as much as possible. And he concludes, the universe must be unique. So this argument is very harshly criticized by a few scholars. That you might know, the demiurge has even been called to be insane because this argument seems not to be valid. Why not? Because it is not because you, if you are an artist, it is not because you have one model that you should produce only one image of it. We can even think that it would be strange to be a craftsman making only one bed from a model. You would be a better craftsman if you can do 2, 3, 5, or even lots of beds. And so one solution to escape the problem of the validity of this argument is to say that it is not a deductive argument, but that it is a practical reasoning. That's Burnett famous answer in this article about the ἐικός mythos. So that is, the demiurge is not producing a kind of deductive reasoning here, but is doing a practical reasoning. So my argument about this argument would be that it is actually a deductive argument, but of course, to be valid, something is missing. So then you might say, well, if it's missing, it's not valid. You should not have occult premises if you are a good philosopher. But you know, you could look in Plato and see that lots of times that there are some occult premises that you have to supply. But not entering into that. But of course, what you should suppose to make this argument valid, it's somehow that, well, yes, the demiurge wants to make the image the best image from a model. But he's not merely a craftsman or an artist who wants to copy an image. He also wants to make the best possible image, and it does not prevent him to choose some properties of the intelligible that he thinks should also be applied to the model, which would not be, properties that enter, strictly speaking, into a kind of production of an image, like the property we are talking here is the unicity of the universe. But of course, even having said that, it is not completely certain that this argument would convince us. And so why not? Because a little bit before, Timaeus has provided another argument, and he said that about the model of the universe to be the best model, so the form of the animal, must be complete. So all-encompassing, all the four species must be somehow parts of this model. And of course, the idea that you have behind these premises is that something is better, a result is better, if it is complete, that incomplete. That the Muse explicitly say that. And then if you think about that, you might say, well, but what does it mean to be complete for the universe? After all, the demiurge has four species inside this complete model. Why would he not create only one member of each species? For example, a world with one fish, one human being, one bird, and that's it. For example, of course, we might think it's not the way participation works, because participation is always the participation of the many in relation to one unique form. So, of course, and the text explicitly said it, the demiurge is going to create or fabricate all the members of the species. So we'll have, it does not give exactly the number, but it's no problem with the number of souls, but we have the many in each species. But there is an exception, which is the universe, because the universe has only one image of the form of the animal. And that's a problem, because again, participation is always of the many toward the one. Now, we could ask ourselves, why not having more than one universe? And as you probably know it, Timaeus is asking himself this question. When he is talking about the five solids, which are used to be a model of the four elements, he is saying that the demiurge is going to use four of them for the four elements, and the fifth one, he might use it for the shape of the universe, but also it's already said to be a sphere, so we're not clear about that. But Timaeus adds, actually, maybe the demiurge used each of the solid to be the shape of one world, and in that case, we would have like 5 universes. And when he talked about this very famous hypothesis, the Timaeus tells us that it is probably not the solution he thinks is the best. He's saying, okay, an infinity of universe, that's not possible. One universe, it's my position. Say, I'm summing up what Timaeus said. But if someone were to say, why does not the demiurge do like that and create like 5 sub-universes? He said that's also a possibility. And he's saying that we should treat the one who defend this thesis as a friend. And what's interesting about this kind of hesitation, in my opinion, is that Timaeus specifically recognized that there are different configuration of the arguments. If you want to see where I'm getting by, either you put as a priority the idea of unicity, which is a possibility, and probably the possibility that Timaeus wants to defend, that is a better universe if it's unique. But you can also say, well, the universe might be better if it would be complete. And complete, which would mean exemplify the five shape of the solids. Of course, Timaeus is not going into that direction, so we don't know the details, but in some way, the five worlds should be harmonized in a way that they would also have some kind of unity, and might not be possible according to the geometrical properties of the solid. But we can at least imagine an alternative possibility. As I say, Timaeus recognizes it's a possibility. If you want a counterfactual version of our universe, when we would have like those five universes, but somehow harmonized into a kind of unity. So I don't think, because I think I have like 5 minutes left, no, something like that. Yes, more or less.
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Excellent. So I leave aside the second part, which is about, I talked about the macroscopic part of the universe and the microscopic part of the universe. Just to tell you that if you look at the passage, you would have exactly the same hesitation about the choice of the two triangles. Timaeus is telling us that he decided to adopt those two basic triangles that you know very well of. But again, if someone would have another possibility in this kind of game of child puzzle, as Comfort said, when you're supposed to also in your mind kind of associated all the triangle to explain what are the four elements and how they can transmute it into themselves when they have. If someone would have another hypothesis and another kind of basic triangle, again, we should treat this person as a friend. So, and again, for the sake of time, but I can talk about that later. I'm not going into the detail, but the idea that you do have in the Timaeus, in various parts of the discourse, the idea that the arguments which are developed, which are theory of deduction, can be somehow combined into different arguments. And that's somehow more or less exactly what the model mental position of the thought experiments defend. Of course, I should, in the last 3 minutes, maybe just give you some objection, but I'm sure there will be other objection in the discussion, but again, this thesis. And I will not give the answers to this objection because probably we have a discussion for that. But of course, the first problems which might appear is that, so what is the demiurge in this vision and of the Timaeus discourse of the thought experiment? And the conclusion I want to get to is that the demiurge is a kind of epistemological tool which presents the reader and Timaeus interlocutor a view of the universe in its again macro and micro details, and that is so. The demiurge is not, in my view, I'm saying that very affirmatively, is not an intellect or is not a demiurge who fabricate the universe, but it's a point of view which enables us to imagine, to visualize some aspect of the universe which we could not, or which we cannot check on verify in empirical experiments. But you might say, well, there is you need an intellect in the universe, and my answer short would be yes, you need, and you have one, which is the world soul. Just to make it clear, but that would open a long discussion. So the second objection or difficulty would be, of course, the question of the young gods, because you might say, but it seems to be that the young gods should not be excluded from the thought experiment because they are just the extension of the demiurgic work. And of course, sometimes Timaeus is say they, sometimes he say she. So even Timaeus seems to mix between the singular and the plural. So you might say, well, it's a little bit artificial to isolate it, just this kind of two aspects of the macrocosm, the microcosm part of the experiment, because all you've got afterwards is part of the same thought experiment. And I think it's a fair point, but I would resist to that, precisely because I think the most important part of the thought experiment, if you defend the mental model view on thought experiment, is that you should get something you could not get, as I said, that was my second criteria, only with arguments. And I think for the rest of what happened in the Timaeus, you know, the biological and psychological and ethical parts, I'm not completely sure that you cannot get that by mere arguments, so that you could not translate that into and again deductive and not deductive. That's why I would focus on the demiurge work, not the Jungians. And of course, I can say more also about that. And then there is a consequence about what is participation, because for people who defend that the demiurge is a nous in the universe, they would defend that participation has two aspects: a kind of proto-participation, which is the appearance of the traces of the four elements in the receptacle, and then the work of the demiurge, who are making it more beautiful. And that way it would be called the best of the cause. But the demiurge would be a necessary condition for participation. So a consequence of my view is that actually, no, the demiurge is a kind of, I would call it a kind of, not microscope, but ontoloscope, which help us to see, to visualize what is participation in different sequences, you know, like when you do a medical exam, magnetic resonance images, you've got all the sequences of your brain, and then you put them together and you've got what your brain is. And that's a little bit, in my view, what's happening in the Timaeus. We have the different sequences of the participation, but participation, in my opinion, is nothing more than the participation of the sensible to the form of the four elements. And I can, of course, talk more about that in the discussion. And the last question would be, but of course there is so text 5, I didn't quote it, but I'll keep it for the discussion. But text 6, there is this very important phrases when the demiurge is giving his discourse to the young gods and he's delegating his work, and he's saying, text 6, finding my will as bound yet stronger and more sovereign than those wherewith you were bound together when you came to be, speaking to the gods. And so you might say, well, here it seems to be saying that the demiurge will, Buddhist, is a will, is a bond, is a strong bond. So it's not just a point of view or something. It is something that seems to be important from an ontological point of view. And I would defend the idea that in a very famous, sorry, I didn't put it there, passage of the Timaeus, we have of the Phaedrus 99b5-6. We have also the mention of the divine bonds, which are identified to the good. And that's with this point I want to conclude, is that, of course, when you say that the demiurge is the best things, the best cause of becoming, and the best member of the intelligible, you might say that it means that it is a part of the intelligible, and of course, lots of people defend that. But you also might try to defend, as I wish, that actually the demiurge is again a kind of point of view, a kind of ontological scope, which help us not to visualize and to understand only what the universe is, but why the universe is the best possible universe that we have. So goodness that we are saying about the demiurge is actually the goodness that we can try to visualize, to understand, to contemplate in the universe. And in that sense also, wish of the demiurge, the bones of the demiurge would not be any other thing, other thing that relationship that you have in the universe, and that we have to try to understand how, namely to understanding the process of fabrication of the universe, and how by putting ourselves inside the mind of the divine craftsmen. I've been a little bit long, so sorry about that, but I'm done. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Professor Pitteloud, for the wonderful talk. And now I pass the floor to Sam Yelton, who's going to offer a commentary. So
great.
Sam,
Do you want me to share my response, Pedro, or should I just?
I think so. I think it
Great.
is easier to follow if you
Okay.
do this.
1 second then, and I'll get that up. I'm not seeing it in my chat, so I'll just read it, and hopefully I'll be able to get it up later, just in the interest of time.
Sure.
And just as a caveat, this is drawn from a version of Professor Pitteloud's presentation essay, which I believe is forthcoming to be published. So if I reference anything that wasn't covered in the presentation, I hope that is just means we can put it on the table for the discussion to follow and expand on what was presented here today. But anyway, I'll begin. It's only appropriate to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to Professor Pitteloud for his interesting and insightful paper, which brings out important aspects of the demiurge's function in the Timaeus, as well as the role of thought experiments in the whole of Plato's philosophical method. Yet at the same time, this puts me as a respondent in a difficult position. I find myself empathizing with Timaeus's lesser gods, having to follow and expand upon the design of their predecessor with the limited ability at their command. Nevertheless, I will do my best in what follows to construct an adequate foundation for further discussion. In doing so, I will particularly focus on two main tasks. First, to expand and clarify the epistemological view of the demiurge we have just heard, and how it relates to other sections and concepts in the Timaeus. And second, to explore exactly what the thought experiment means in the Platonic context, and in particular, what its unique features as a non-argumentative counterfactual means of generating knowledge suggest both about their role in the Timaeus and in the entire Platonic corpus. First off, then, I would like to explore the implications of considering the demiurge primarily as an epistemological tool. As I read this paper, the actual constitution of the universe in this view is brought about by the interaction in some manner of the world soul, receptacle, and the intelligible model. One question I think might be valuable is to see if all the usages of which the demiurge is put in the formation of the cosmos can be carried out by this trinity. As an answer one way or the other would help spell out the distinct usage and boundaries of the demiurge qua epistemological tool. One area which you brought up towards the end of your presentation, which I'd like to revisit, is the issue of the Odyssey. I'm drawing here particularly from David Sedley's work on ancient creationism. One of the key roles that the demiurge as a craftsman plays in the content of the Timaeus is as a source of the justification for seeing the world as good. By serving as the best possible agent with the best possible models and intentions, the demiurge in this reading provides a reason for believing that our universe is, in spite of what we may otherwise think, the best possible that could be constructed out of the material available. I wonder then if this sense of benevolent instrumental agency is still present if the demiurge is turned into an epistemological viewpoint. For example, early on in the paper, it suggested that some theories that dispense with the demiurge propose that the cosmos comes into being through a process of the reflection of the intelligible into the realm of the sensible. It's perhaps a limitation of trying to understand such cosmic processes from a merely human vantage point, but the terminology of reflection suggests a sort of natural process without any sort of agent to direct or manage it. If this understanding is accurate, it would seem we would lose out on the justificatory role of the demiurge insofar as the features of the universe, instead of being designed to be the best as they reasonably could be, would instead seem to emerge simply from contingent factors in the meeting of the intelligible and the sensible. In particular, far from having a reason to accept the oddities or opinions in the cosmos as ultimately being the product of a benevolent design, it would seem that we would have to take them as simply being what they appear to us, with no larger purpose in making an overall good universe. To be sure, I think there's a suggestion later on in the paper that might lessen this issue. I'm thinking here in particular of a later indication that the world soul in its contemplations of the intelligible in some sense takes on the role of the producing agent of the cosmos. While I do not believe this is to equate with the world soul, this is not to equate the world soul with the demiurge on a one-to-one basis, insofar as the world soul ensures that the modeling of the intelligible in the material of the sensible is done in the best possible way, it would still be sufficient to account for the presence of seeming evils and ills in the world. Yet I think this answer in turn raises another question that must be addressed to understand more fully the function of the demiurge, namely that of where the world soul in this model comes from. While the receptacle and the intelligible both have a certain sort of eternity or timelessness in Timaeus's reckoning, the same is not true of this world soul, which emerges from the construction of the demiurge. If we are to think of the world soul as an agent in the construction of the cosmos, it seems we must choose between two understandings of the world soul's origins, both of which I believe have interpretive complexities to be resolved. On the one hand, we could take it that the world soul has always existed and that it and the cosmos it produces has always been. This seems to me to be suggested by certain comments made in the paper about the pre-demiurgic chaos of the receptacle being representations necessary for facilitating the demiurgic thought experiment rather than an actual reality. Yet if the cosmos has always existed, this would seem in some ways to move it out of the realm of becoming into being one of the permanent beings, insofar as the Timaeus asserts that it will never pass away, and this conception has eliminated its coming to be. To be sure, the cosmos would not possess all the qualities that Timaeus lists for his eternal beings. It is, for example, sensible rather than a thing grasped by intellect. Instead, it would seem to be a creation that stands at the borderline of Timaeus's groupings, not quite fish or fowl, and if one takes the most pessimistic reading, perhaps not graspable either by reason or a likely story. On the other hand, if we instead assert that the world soul has a coming to be, we must wonder if it was crafted or simply emerged. The former, obviously, is simply the reintroduction of the demiurge into the account. The latter opinion, contrarily, would seem to fall victim to the theodicy issue just discussed, as we would have no reason to suspect that such creation ex nihilo had come about in the best way possible. While I know the main focus of this essay is on epistemology rather than cosmology, I would be interested to hear what Professor Pitteloud would have to say to these defenses of the demiurge. One other question that I would like to explore in this vein is how the demiurgic thought experiment is related to other parts of Timaeus's account of cosmic construction, and in particular, I would like to revisit what was touched on very briefly towards the end of the presentation, and that is the relationship between the demiurgic thought experiment and the fabrication of the empirical world by the lesser gods that the demiurge creates. I think, as expressed, much of it is quite, as Professor Pitteloud say, that we're not gaining new knowledge that we would expect from a thought experiment. Instead, we're being offered a bunch of just so teleology that explains sort of the empirical facts of the sensible world as it appears to us. Yet, even if this is true for much of this part of the Timaeus, I do wonder if we might profitably consider some parts of the dialogue here as being thought experiments similar to the demiurge. I have two arguments I'd like to address in this vein. In the first place, the narrative of fabrication here does, I think, have episodes that serve a sort of similar scoping function to what we see with the demiurge. For example, at 73b to d in the Timaeus, we have a description of how the god, Theos, which, as Professor Pitteloud mentioned, we have an interesting sort of wavering here between the singular and the plural, manufactured the marrow as the seed of the soul out of the finest triangles of the four elements, a process that reveals invisible elements of our construction that would otherwise be inaccessible to our senses. Second, there are opportunities in this part of the Timaeus where, similar to what we find with the demiurge, we can enter the laboratory of the mind to simulate different outcomes of various designs for mortals, and hence gain a new appreciation, or even perhaps knowledge, of the pragmatic reasoning behind it. I'm thinking here in particular of the passage at 75b to d, where the gods deliberate over the covering of the human head. While a thick covering would provide for a longer, healthier, and more pleasant lifespan to the human race, the thinner skin of the head allows for more sensitivity and strengthening of our rational elements. Certainly, there's an element here of apologetic theology, as we find elsewhere with the lesser gods. Yet are not these sorts of justifications in the demiurgic portion of the text as well? For example, the explanation for why the planets have the orbits they do compared to the other celestial bodies. And insofar as we are invited to consider scenarios of human fabrication, it seems that we are here, just as with the demiurge, to engage in a sort of mental manipulation and construction leading to new understanding, albeit at a human rather than a cosmic scale. I would be interested then to hear a little more about how you distinguish the two cognitive processes we use to grasp the action of these two groups of deities, and whether these epistemological differences also have any bearing on how we should take the actual existence of the lesser gods compared to the demiurge. After these 2 points, I would like now to turn to some broader questions concerning the role of thought experiments in the Timaeus and in Plato's broader philosophical practice. In doing so, I would first like to take up the question that is touched on in the first part of your essay. That is the dividing line between thought experiments and other kind of fictional narratives. As you point out there, the divide between these two categories can, from certain perspectives, seem quite porous. In my reading of the essay, it is the third criterion for thought experiments, that they are cognitive or productive of new knowledge, that serves as the main divider between these sorts of counterfactuals on the other hand, and other kinds of fiction such as literature on the other. Yet there do seem to be some models of artistic works that allow them to function successfully as thought experiments. I'm thinking in particularly here, for example, of David Davies' essays on art and thought experiments, where he argues that the mental model view of thought experiments, as we just heard about, provides a plausible way by which works of art, in particular literary fictions, can indeed work as thought experiments and thus have valid cognitive results, be productive of new knowledge. I don't wish to suggest that this means all fictions are thought experiments in the strong sense. Being able to mentally model what it would mean for me to be accepted at Hogwarts, for instance, is perhaps not much of an intellectual achievement. I do think, however, that there is at least an open possibility that these works of fiction can satisfy the essay's third criterion, and in some sense serve as producers of knowledge. Such a claim would not, I think, be shocking to either Plato or to the wider Hellenic culture. As Aristophanes proudly claims in The Frogs, it is the poets who, through their plays, serve as the real educators of the cities. Indeed, such a view makes a great deal of sense if we consider the tragedies and comedies of ancient Athens as thought experiments. Going through the criteria laid out in the essay, it is self-evident that tragedies and comedies are counterfactual episodes. Plato himself would surely agree, going further, that these works also fulfill the second criterion, as being either the result of a poet's divine mania or ignorant mimesis. They are most definitely non-argumentative in form. It is this very lack of an argument or account, I think, that would lead Plato to reject the whole of poetry as fulfilling the third requirement for a thought experiment, that of being knowledge producing. In the Ion, to take one of a number of examples, it is the very fact that the eponymous rhapsode is able to speak well without an account behind what he is saying that demonstrates the ignorance of the poets and their followers regarding their subject matter. Yet at first glance, this seems to present a difficulty for thought experiments in general in the Platonic context. If poetry is disqualified as a knowledge source because of its non-cognitive aspect, by what means would we justify Plato's usage of thought experiments in the context of his own philosophy? Since I'm running out of time, I'll move to my final point, which is what in final analysis should we take the cognitive products gained from running thought experiments? If I can summarize what it seems to be the consensus of the field from Thomas Kuhn on, it seems that there is some broad agreement that these activities are able capable of producing knowledge in a robust sense. But what sort of thing is this knowledge in the context of a Platonic dialogue that employs thought experiments? We can take, for example, I think the Ring of Gyges is one way. I have a concern in this area that it's often cited in literature as sort of the Platonic thought experiment par excellence, except that the conclusions gained by running that thought experiment, that the life of injustice is preferable to the life and justice of justice, are in fact refuted by the rest of the argument of the Republic. And you can compare that, I think, profitably to the episode of the slave boy in the Meno, where even though Meno is ignorant, or even though the slave boy is ignorant of geometry, at the beginning of the process of working through the arguments, he's still able to come to new knowledge about the properties of a rectilineal figure, albeit with heavy assistance from Socrates at the end of the process, which it seems thought experiments are able to do. So I just say that to add, how should we take thought experiments? What is the value of their knowledge? Is it knowledge in the robust sense as either geometrical figures or even the forms are in the Platonic epistemology ontology? Or could we better take them, and this is what I would go into more detail if I had more time, could we better take them as sort of pointers that provide us with the means to sort of begin abstracting, to begin moving up the ladder from concerns with actual realities, but rather through the investigation mentally of counterfactuals to begin sort of the ascent to knowledge in a stronger ontological epistemological sense. But I just want to conclude again by thanking Professor Pitteloud for a very interesting talk, and I look forward to the general discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sam, for your commentary. Now, Professor Pitteloud, do you want to give some brief remarks about the commentary? Could you?
Yes, but as I would like to have some time for the discussion, you will have to cut me, because I suppose I could talk with Sam for hours about all the point and very interesting point is made. So I'm sorry, and I would love to have his text if he could send me after and continue the discussion. So there are so many points I would like to discuss. So one thing about and all are very interesting about the young gods, because I think it's I mean, I can see why we have some kind of admiration for the work of the young gods, and we don't want to exclude them. And that also, I think, will address the last point you made. So I think it is true, and it is natural to in a sense to say that it's part of the same thought experiment, because if the thought experiment is to fashion the universe, then you have to do it until it's detailed. But there are some differences between the work of the Demiurge and the work of the young gods. So it's a little bit an exaggeration of my parts when I said that, but I think that in some aspects, and maybe not all of them, the work of the young gods is not very difficult, so to say. But I will explain that. So what the Demiurge must do is, it's the text I quoted, is to try to translate the intelligible into the sensible. And that's complicated. He must think, and he has different possibilities. You know, for example, the argument why he decide the shape of the universe. So he decide that it's going to be a spheric shape and so on. But he's giving us an argument why the spherical shapes is the best somehow exemplification of an aspect of the intelligible. Same thing with circular motion and so on. So what do the young gods do and their work? They actually copy the works of the Demiurge. So, for example, why the human being has a head which has this spheric form? Because it is the form of the universe as a whole. So they just copy that, and it's not very difficult to. I'm sorry, I'm provoking a little bit about the young gods, and so if you. And also it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but if you think about Republic 10 and the 2 degrees of imitation, so the first one is the form of the bed, then the bed, and then an imitation, painting. And you might say, well, it seems clear that for Plato, the last degree is lower. And I would say in some sense that what the young gods are doing in their work is a little bit like that. They imitate what has already been an imitation. But maybe you would not agree that it is the case in all their work. And that's as a very important point you made at last, one of the last points you made, because there are a lot, is so what really brings a thought experiment like that in Plato? That's very true, what you said. We should discuss, if we have more time, the relationship between different kinds of images that Plato uses, and for example, myth. Because as you know, there are also a discussion about if myths are only communication tools, or if they bring something new that the logos cannot bring in. And so, of course, and you very rightly associated the question of fiction to thought experiment, because it is true that there is a view that you can associate thought experiment in fiction. One of the difficulties of this view in my mind is that if you are too generous with thought experiments, then everything will be a thought experiment. Fiction, books, dystopian fiction, and some people defend that. But if it is the case, then it's a little bit difficult, because then you might say, well, any kind of images is the allegory of the cave, the thought experiment. And I would like to talk about the Atlantis, but I leave that also outside. But, and now I'm concluding because I'm taking too much, but I think an advantage of living outside the young gods will help us to understand what's the originality of the thought, of this thought experiment as the demiurgic fabrication of the world. It is true that you have a lot of counterfactual situation in Plato. And I tend to agree with what you said about Republic, for example, the invisibility ring, and it is true that I will not put my finger, I don't know what's the expression, my hand to be cut, if I had to defend that you cannot translate some of these images of thought experiment or into kind of reduction, for example, reductive argument. I just want to mention two other which we can find in Plato, which are kind of similar to the Timaeus and very useful, is the thought experiment where in the Phaedrus, sorry, and in the law, where we are put in the situation to imagine that the world would come to a stop, and that we need the world soul, to make it in motion. It's commonly said to be a counterfactual scenario. Can you translate that to a reduction? I think so. And so to go back to your point, I think what the young gods do, even if in a sense you're right, it's part of a thought experiment, but this kind of thought experiment you can translate into argument or deduction. But the part made by the demiurge, which I talked in this presentation, I'm not sure you can. And when Brown, it's the intuition-based account, called this a Platonic account of thought experiment, what he means by that, and he used this formulation, is that with this kind of thought experiment, which you think can bring new pieces of knowledge, you somehow have a look through the window of the what he called the Platonic worlds, of course. And I think it's actually what's a little bit, it's happening through the demiurge thought experiment. That is what we, but of course, for example, contrary to Brody or to Burnett, it's a very metaphysical reading of the Timaeus. I think what's at heart of the demiurge work is to try to understand what participation is. And that's of something which again, I don't think the young gods have to do, even if you can call that a kind of thought experiment. I would actually do it without problem, but not a kind of thought experiment that you cannot translate into any kind of argument. And I would like to defend that what we do about participation, because of course we are human beings and we don't have access, and we need to try to imagine, to understand that, is something we can do only by trying to put in the mind or footstep of the Timaeus. And that's the originality of the thought experiment of the Timaeus, which I think it's a kind of unique. So maybe it's one of its kind, in a sense, in Plato's dialogue. But there's so many other things I would like to talk about the world soul and all the argument, but I think it's better to leave some time to the discussion, maybe, and maybe I can come back if there are some questions related to that. But again, thank you very much for the very useful comments.
Thank you, Professor Pitteloud, for your response. And now Professor Jill Gordon has a question.
Yes, thank you. That last exchange was really interesting and to a degree on point to what I wanted to ask about. I'm really stimulated by this notion of the thought experiment in Plato. And I think you said right just before I got called on something to the effect, maybe this is a unique example. And I don't think so. And based on the criteria that you set out, I want to give two examples, and I'll try not to go on too long. And I have two questions, the answer to the second of which depends on the first. So here's one example. The forms themselves, I think, meet all of your criteria. It's an attempt to visualize the invisible. In fact, eidos is a shape or a form, a visible thing that is supposed to have us think counterfactually. You know, what if there were these principles that organized all of the pluralities in our world? And you mentioned at another point, you know, there are no empirical experiments that will ever tell us that. And the aim is to translate the intelligible, you know, into the sensible. And I think the forms, which some people call a theory of forms, which I personally disagree with, might fit your case of thought experiment. And I'll be very brief with my second example, but I think about the immortality of the soul, and especially the quote unquote arguments that get made in the Phaedo and don't really cut the mustard, so to speak. So my two questions are the following. Do you think that something like the forms and the immortality of the soul fit this model of thought experiments? And if they do, that puts us in a really interesting position, because then some of the most fundamental things we think of as Platonism are these counterfactual entrees into the unintelligible world. And then finally, a big question, if you do think those are thought experiments, does that implicate all of metaphysics? Is all of metaphysics this sort of thought experiment that you're laying out? So thank you.
Thank you so much for the very interesting question, and which brings me a lot to think about. I'm not sure I will be able to answer to all of them, but I'll try. So the point about the form. So of course, that comes back to a point I said before. If you want to have a clear definition of what thought experiments are, you need to be able to limit that to specific cases, and because if not, you might say that each time we need, I'm talking in Plato, of course, production of images, or using our imagination to get something, and of course we know that for the forms we need to imagination or the production of image. You might end up with a very broad version of what thought experiments are, and that's a possibility. Just to make a similar point about the forms and 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 also come back to the Timaeus. And because also I didn't talk about that, but what we have also in the description of the geometrization of the traces in the Timaeus is also a kind of explanation, in my opinion, of what is participation, and that's done again in a kind of, you can say, images or quasi-spatial way. And even you might say, you know, the kind of stereometry that was alluded to in the Republic, and which is an example in the Timaeus. And of course, I mean, I don't think it's too polemical to say that because Plato said that very explicitly in the Republic, we need the use of images to do mathematics and to understand. But the difference, which is very interesting in the Timaeus, it's a kind of let's say, image in motion. You know, it's you know, when I say I quote a Concord child puzzle, and also the Timaeus says something which is very interesting, is that it brings us a kind of pleasure to do this kind of manipulation but that's what we do in trying to understand participation. And in some sense, I think it is, so that's not explicit in the text, but you know, at the beginning of the Timaeus, Socrates' wishes is to have an example of the constitution it described yesterday in words. He wants to see it in action, you know, like the animal, the painting of animal, beautiful animal, you want to see them in motion. And that, in terms of history, it means that it was his constitution to be in wars, how to behave in kind of war context. And I think Socrates is very happy with what, of course, Timaeus is doing, because he's also giving us a kind of images in motion of what is participation. So, you know, just a kind of fixed one where you have the participation of the many by the foreman, but he's trying to explain that into again in motion, lively. And so, in that sense, to go back to one of your points, I would think that it is, of course, very important to use the notion of images to understand participation. Can you apply that to the forms in general? Maybe to some specific aspect, it would be you know, better maybe the participation, or maybe, because then I would. Again, there will be this objection that it's too, you know, it's too open and not enough delimited. And that's come to your second point about the immortality of the soul, or other example. We can think about a lot of examples, but not to talk too much. I would say, of course, thought experiments are always referred to a specific area. So you have ethical thought experiment. So maybe the immortality of the soul would be a kind of psychological thought experiment. I would also defend that we have a lot of political thought experiment in Plato. Even you know, like the Republic, you might say it's a kind of thought experiment. So I would tend to have sympathy with this idea of trying to integrate many things, and at the same time, I think it should be tested case by case. So maybe you don't agree with my criteria. You should decide which criteria you like and see if it works. But clearly, I think to conclude, the idea that for Plato, it's not possible to only use arguments, but we need something else that you can call myth, that you can call the use of imagination or the production of images. All the things he criticized, if it's the sophist or other people doing it, but and even himself in the most important part of, for example, his metaphysics to conclude about the forms, he is of course using images, and he's making us visualize somehow what the form is. A very interesting question coming from your point is that, is it possible to do metaphysics without the visualization, without images? That's a very interesting question.
Great, wonderful. So Antonio just posted here in the chat a link for the handouts and presentations we have today for this table. And is there any other question to Professor Pitteloud? So I'll read Professor Gordon's comment. To clarify, I'm in favor of an expansive notion of thought experiments across the corpus. I don't think we can do philosophy, including Platonic philosophy, without it.
No, I think I agree with that.
Fantastic. So any other question? I had a specific question about the polynode in the Phaedrus. How would you read the cosmic and divine procession of the gods across the universe, and then out in reaching the outer ring of universe to behold the forms and contemplate? Would you think that it is in the same level of thought experiment as what you're exploring the Timaeus? So the comparison would be with the polynodes, the winged chariot myth, since we cannot know what the soul actually is, just what it looks like. So because to tell what the soul is would require divine knowledge, divine narration, and so we can only approach what it looks like. So it's image, it's resemblance with a winged chariot. So how would you deal with these, with the polynodes in your interpretation?
So thanks. So it's very similar to the last question. So I think it's very interesting to see that there are some maybe not sympathy, but at least some people would not see it impossible to consider also other texts, like you're talking about the Phaedrus myth as a thought experiment. So I would say a little bit the same thing I've said for the last question. Of course, one thing which is complicated about the Phaedrus myth is that and maybe I also should have said that about the Timaeus myth. It's much more than just a thought experiment. You know, it's much more than my way of trying to sing it. Of course, it's an art of fiction. Of course, it's a piece of art. Of course, it's not only about participation or cosmology. It's also about ethics. I'm saying that because, of course, in the Phaedrus, you have much more than the question of participation. You have the psychological, the ethical, and all the experiments you have. And so again, I would say it's important to be able to delimitate exactly what kind of thought experiment, because you cannot have a thought experiment about everything at the same time. So, but in the very specific question about participation, I would say, again, a little bit the same thing I've said before. It is true that you need somehow to be able to visualize those abstract things that Plato calls forms. Is it necessary? Can you do it without it? I suppose it depends what do you think forms are. Because if you think that forms are, I don't know, essences or definition or things like that, you might be able to avoid that. If you think that forms are paradigm, which I think is the case clearly in the Timaeus, but not, then I think it's very likely to have to defend the idea that you need some part of again, it's a bit strange to talk about visualization because you find an equivalent in Plato, but at least an image or a myth. But I would at the same time, I'm not sure you can say that every myth is a thought experiment. That's also an important question. Of course, we all know that there are different kinds of myth in Plato, and it's very difficult to have a kind of united notion of myth. I don't know. Some people have defended that the end of the Republic, the myth of air, is a kind of thought experiment. Is it? If it is, we have a character, which is air, which helps us to visualize. Of course, it would be an ethical or maybe political thought experiment, maybe more ethical. And we see something through his eyes. Again, do we think that air really existed and had this experience? Maybe, but it's not necessary. I'm saying that because the same thing about the demiurge. We see something through the demiurge view, but does it mean it really exists and he really did that? Maybe, but maybe not. So of course, you know, maybe I can end up saying that each time we think to you know, in the very famous images to understand Plato, like, you know, like the swan, it just escapes us and go away. So it's a bit like that. Can we really use that? It seems to me that it helps us to understand, but of course, Plato's Timaeus or Phaedrus, of which we are going to talk very soon, I think, are much richer than just this very specific dimension. I still think that it's a useful way of trying to understand not only what Plato meant, but also one could say the actuality of Plato, which we are talking today about Plato today. So that's also something I think is somehow interesting.
Great, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Both of you, Professor Pitteloud, Sam, for your commentary. And now I think it's time to move to our next part of this table, this round table, with Professor Fierro presentation with the ensuing commentary by Cássio. So María Angélica Fierro is a professor of philosophy in the Faculty of Arts of the University of Buenos Aires, UBA. She is also an associate researcher at the National Council of Scientific and Technological Research, the CONICET from Argentina, and assistant lecturer in ancient philosophy and Greek language and culture for the Faculty of Arts of the University of Buenos Aires. She has taught numerous undergraduate and graduate courses in her country and abroad, and published several articles in scientific journals, as well as chapters of books in Spanish and English, mainly regarding Plato's philosophy. Her translation of Plato's Phaedrus into Spanish, with notes and commentaries, has recently been published by Collier Printing House, Buenos Aires, Argentina. So just a very recent product. And Cássio holds a master at PUC São Paulo, Pontifícia Universidade Católica from São Paulo, and is currently a PhD student at PUC São Paulo. He has a scholarship from the São Paulo Research Foundation, FAPESP, and is working on the theme of Plato's philosophy of language. So, and Professor Fierro's talk is entitled Plato's Appropriation of to ἐικός in the Phaedrus. So, Professor Fierro, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much to the organizing committee for organizing such a wonderful event, and all of you for being here today. I think that Plato is not just today. Plato, I think it's forever. Well, what I will do today is to share with you some of my recent research, which is based on some conclusions I reached through my recent translation of Plato's Phaedrus. I'm very, very happy that finally came to light. And it's based also on the chapter of a book in honor to Anthony Preus, which will be published by Routledge very soon, I think. So as I have abridged my presentation, you can find a full version of it, I think, in that book. Anyway, I have shared the PowerPoint I will use for my presentation and the paper itself, but I won't read it all because there is no time for that. Okay, so. Very good. Well, title of my paper, as Pedro said, is Plato's appropriation of to ἐικός in the Phaedrus. I will be based on Berne's Greek text and Rose translation that will appear in English in this case. No kind, it doesn't move the, no, okay, here it is, okay. It has been traditionally considered that insofar as for philosophy's main concern should be knowledge of objective truth, Plato had a visceral abhorrence of rhetoric because of interest in just persuading on the basis of the mere appearance of truth and sophistic skills. Thus, to this day, Aristotle's son has carried on his broad shoulders the responsibility of an irreconcilable dispute between philosophy and rhetoric, as well as of the old contest between philosophy and poetry. Along these lines, it has been argued that in the Phaedrus, in continuity with his developments in the Gorgias, Plato denies that rhetoric can be a technique, or at least that if it were a technique, it should be ultimately be reduced to dialectics. So in the Status Questionis, we have this exegetical line, which is followed by authors such as Cole, Vallejo, Campos, and Gagarin. Here I intend to show that in the Phaedrus, to ἐικός is approached in a complex way, where two meanings of this concept are involved. On the one hand, ἐικός is taken in its ordinary Greek sense of what is plausible, probable, likely to someone, including things which are plausible but contrary to what actually happened. From this usual epistemic meaning of the term, Plato builds up a critical approach to it. On the other hand, ἐικός can refer to something just resembling reality that the philosopher knowingly makes up in order to bring someone closer to the understanding of truth. In this case, Plato combines the usual epistemic meaning with his more etymological sense of to be like the truth, along with a more explicit introduction of his own philosophical categories. My proposal then follows the exegetical lines of the Phaedrus from authors such as North, Bossi, Centrone, Fideli, Yunis, Rossetti, who claim that rhetoric can be positively used by philosophy in different ways. They claim that, and can even be identified with philosophy itself. The neuter participle ἐικός, together with the masculine and feminine form ἐικός with omega and ἐκουίας, as a resulting nominal formation of ἐοικά, was related to one of the senses of this verb, methinks, to seem to someone, and so mainly meant like truth in the sense of likely or probable. Derivatively, ἐικός was also applied more specifically in the intellectual and moral fields to refer to what is reasonable and equitable. As all these uses of the term show, the current meaning of this adjective always conveyed then something which someone has concluded as probably true, and so refer to an epistemological state. However, ἐικός also kept some connection with the meaning of resemblance, likeness, which also belonged from its origins to ἐοικά, and was present as well in other words that shared the same root, such as the verb ἐκάτσω, to represent with an image, and the noun ἐικόν, image. Through this last meaning of resembling, ἐικός would allude to a factual status where the emphasis is put on both the analogous character of two things and the fact that one thing is the real thing, while the other one is something ἐικός, that is to say, something which is just like it. The epistemological sense of ἐικός would then come into play insofar as this relation of similitude between things is perceived, described, or created by someone. In the next sections, I aim to show that Plato makes use of these two meanings of ἐικός. Thus, on one hand, he leans on the current sense of probable, likely, in order to represent the use of these terms by sophists and orators, while on the other hand, he also takes into account the meaning of like something, resembling, which the etymology of the term suggests as well, in order to line it up with his own philosophical categories and transform it into a virtuous device to bring someone closer to the truth. So I go first to Plato's use of the current sense of ἐικός in the Phaedrus, for which I will take 3 sections of the first part of the Phaedrus. I go to the first one where the ordinary sense of what is plausible, probably likely to someone appears, and is a passage in the prologue. The first occurrence of ἐικός, which I will consider takes place in the context of the so-called Boreas and Eurytia episode, which belongs to the prologue of the Phaedrus. As has been pointed out, here Socrates is ironically depicted as sophoi, the new intellectuals, such as Lysias and the sophists in general, whom Phaedrus uncritically admires because of their ability to build up clever arguments about any subject. In this portrayal of them, Socrates describes as to ἐικός the kind of explanation which hoi sophoi would give about Boreas' abduction of Eurytia, as well as about other mythologemata. These learned men surely would reduce, he says, the mythical story to a likely reasonable elucidation of it. The strength of the northern wind pushed her into the rocks, and so she died. Divergently, Socrates scorns these endless rationalizations of the mythical figures as just some kind of clumsy wisdom, agroikotini sophia, which is typical of a skillful, dedicated, but unfortunate man. This is at Phaedrus 209e to 6. I won't read the passage for reasons of time. To reduce pros vivatsein, this mythical story, katatoikos, would mean here to make a clever conjecture of what might actually happen to Eurytia so that she found her death. Socrates declares that he has no time to elaborate this kind of explanation, not because they are more or less true, better or worse than a mythologema, but because he needs to devote himself to more serious matters, such as to know and to examine himself. So here, for the first time in the dialogue, the ἐκότα explanations of the know-it-alls are presented as trivial speculations in opposition to the inquiry into really serious issues, such as self-knowledge. However, significantly in the following lines, Socrates expands this key idea of the dialogue, that is self-knowledge, by making reference to another mythical character, Typhon, for which he himself provides a rational explanation by decoding this mythologema in terms of whether he, Socrates, has a wild nature as this hurricane creature does, or is rather like a mild tamed animal. Thus, through the right use of a mythical figure such as Typhon, Socrates introduces the question about whether the human soul is typhonic and or antiphonic. In this way, it is suggested that the right use of the icon of Typhon can work as a suitable device in order to explain something truly important, such as what self-understanding of our human condition would be like. From this passage, it follows that Socrates is not interested in disqualifying likely explanations as such, nor in promoting naive acceptance of the authority of traditional myths. He discredits the ἐικός speculation of the know-it-alls about the abduction of Eurytia by Boreas, not because it is a plausible speculation, but because it refers to something not worth spending time on, such as the establishment of the historical truths of irrelevant events. The fact that he himself bases his own explanation of what self-examination would be like on the resemblance between the human soul and Typhon suggests that his main concern lies in what kind of account can be more effective in making someone, in this case Phaedrus, reflect on something which truly matters, as is the nature of one's soul, one's own soul. I go to the second example in the Phaedrus of the current sense of ἐικός. One of the most characteristic devices of the forensic rhetoricians of the time seems to have been to write likely arguments in order to provide their customers with either a successful defense or a powerful prosecution for the trials they had to face at the Athenian courts. Plato's choice of Lysias as the representative of this kind of rhetoric seems to be due to the fact that he was one of the most recognized forensic authors of the time. And in the dialogue, Phaedrus, as a character, offers the utmost expression of the general admiration for Lysias' writing skills. Plato's reason for attributing to him the eroticus, which stands outside of the forensic subject matter that characterizes Lysias' production, must be found in the context of the dialogue. On one hand, the attribution to Lysias of this kind of argument allows Plato to introduce the subject of eros and to start the discussion about its ambiguous nature. On the other hand, it also makes possible to open the discussion on the major theme of the Phaedrus, namely the value of discourses in general and written discourses in particular, without restricting the discussion to forensic speeches. It must be noted that the term ἐικός, in its current meaning of likely, reasonable, I won't read the passages because for reasons of time that's not possible, is often used throughout this speech that Plato ascribes to Lysias. This happens at 231c, 231e, 232c, 233a. These occurrences of ἐικός in Lysias' speech do not seem casual, insofar as his epidixis is in fact a conspicuous example of how, thanks to rhetorical skills, something quite unlikely, such as a beautiful young man preferring to be intimate with a non-lover rather than a lover, turns out to be the most likely thing to do. But Lysias' speech is not intended solely to provide a dramatic representation of this kind of likely arguments. It is also cleverly built up by Plato as an appropriate target for Socrates in his criticism of this type of argumentative construction. Thus, in the first interlude, while Phaedrus claims to be absolutely amazed at Lysias' speech, Socrates expresses his doubts about both its form, lexis, and content, ta pragmata. The discourse is badly organized and just makes random remarks, either true or false. Socrates' first speech works then, that comes after the Lysias speech, as a first demonstration of what would be the most direct procedure in both respects, that is to say, to convey the truth through a proper dialectical argument with a definition of part, because in the second, then we will find another part of eros, part of the real essence of eros by an organized division into genera and species. However, afterwards, Socrates himself derives ex eikotos, the likely good or bad consequences which will follow from this definition if the young boy chooses to be intimate with a lover. So in the second part of the first speech, we find an argument by Socrates from ἐικός. In addition to this, similar to his use of the mythical character of Typhon in the prologue, Socrates will offer to Phaedrus an attractive speech in his second speech, which resembles the truth about important issues such as the nature and immortality of the soul, reincarnation, anamnesis, falling in love, to be mad, etc. Then, although a dialectical description of the nature of something would be the best as far as it's possible, it is not the only way to communicate the truth. On occasion, an explanation based on something like the truth can be more effective. The argument of Lysias is then condemned by Socrates, mainly because of its shortcomings regarding its argumentative structure and the relevance of its context, not just for the ἐικός nature of some of its assertions. I come now to the three examples of the current use of ἐικός as Plato represented in the Phaedrus, which appears now in the second part of the Phaedrus. Τα ἐικότα was devised for all kinds of rhetorical speeches. This we can deduce from Phaedrus' reference to it as one of the refinements which were mentioned in the book's Περιlogon Technes. This is 266d. However, as can be inferred from Antiphon's tetralogies, the ability to make reverse probability arguments was especially essential for a successful prosecution in the Athenian courts. Plato does his own recreation of the forensic employment of ἐικόis speeches when Socrates gives a depiction of them in the following terms at 272 DE. For they, that is to say the forensic rhetoricians, say that in the law courts, no one cares in the slightest for the truth, aletheias melei noudeni, about these things, but only for what is convincing, to piθανού. And that is what is probable, to ἐικός. For they go on to say that sometimes one should not even say what was actually done, autá praxentan, if it is improbable, me ἐκότος, but rather what is probable, ta ἐκότα, both when accusing and defending, and whatever one's purpose when speaking, the probable, to ἐικός, is what must be pursued, which means frequently saying goodbye to the truth, hairen to alethei. The argument from probability is attributed here to Theseus and indirectly to his teacher Corax, to whom the creation of the techne of model speeches based on to ἐικός is ascribed. However, as Gagarin has pointed out, this extreme attribution to forensic rhetoricians of pursuing ἐικόi arguments and of disdaining the truth might be an invention of Plato himself, or at least an exaggerated representation of their kind of performance, insofar as the claims of the courts sometimes were argued not in likelihood, but in fact. This is in Antiphon's first tetralogy, ouken toin ἐκότο ala ergo. It appears an argument based on erga. Notwithstanding, two considerations must be made about this passage. To alethes, for which the orators do not care, is ta praxenta, and factual truth has already been considered as irrelevant by Socrates. We saw that at the Boreas and Oritia episode. B, a likely explanation must not always be preferred, but only when a report of the real event sounds improbable, me ἐκότος. In any case, as shown in the text next section, Plato's intention seemed to go beyond just presenting a distorting portrayal of the orators of his time, inasmuch as, based on his own philosophical premises, he aims at both making a critical analysis of the use of ἐικός by the traditional rhetoric and simultaneously reformulating this device in order to transform it into one of the possible means to bring someone closer to the truth in a Platonic sense, that is to say, to the real essence of everything. So I come now to the second part of my paper, which is Plato's criticisms and reformulations of to ἐικός and his philosophical appropriation of this rhetorical device. While Phaedrus can only conceive the employment of persuasive speeches in the political arena, Socrates moves further and explores the possibility of a rhetorique techne as a universal art of discourse. Plato's movement to this wider and critical appraisal on this topic is also reflected in his approach to the ἐικός arguments, which characterized the traditional rhetoric of his time. Insofar as in D2 that we have just seen, to ἐικός is described as often opposite to the actual truth and at the same time as to pisanon, Plato's recreation of the argumentative procedures as the Athenian courts makes the emphasis fall on the epistemological effect that the speeches should have on the jury, namely on the fact that the arguments should be credible to them independently of the objective truth, and in that sense, likely. In order to achieve a better understanding of how to ἐικός is associated with to pisanon, and a few lines later to pletheidokum, we must move back to an earlier section of the second part of the dialogue, where Plato introduces to doxaston in order to analyze and criticize from this philosophical category of his own how logographers, but also orators, politicians, lawgivers, poets, conceive their mastery in their use of language. Thus, when Socrates claims that the mind which knows the truth is a necessary requirement in order to speak and write well about any subject, Phaedrus answers at 259e, 268, the passage we have on the screen, the following. What I have heard about this, my dear Socrates, is that there is no necessity for the man who intends to be an orator to understand what is really just, that onti dikaia manzane, but only what would appear so to the majority, ta doxatan plethei, of those who will give judgment, and not what is really good or fine, ta ontos agatha e kala, but whatever will appear so, hosa doxei, because persuasion comes from that and not from the truth, ectes aletheias. Phaedrus' character then offers a description of the procedures of traditional rhetoric, which he translates into Platonic terms. The successful orator does not need to know how things actually are, but just what seems to be true to his listeners in order to persuade them and be able to manipulate their beliefs. Thus, Phaedrus' reply, through Phaedrus' replies, the typical Platonic dichotomy between knowing what really is, to onti ontos, that is the truth, and understanding what appears to be, ta doxanta, non-truth or less truth, if you want, is already introduced, together with a concern for the essence of moral values, such as what is just, beautiful, and good, rather than for the veracity of specific events, that is the factual truth, which was at the stage at the Athenian courts. Through a funny example, Socrates brings to light why such lack of commitment to the truth is dangerous, not only for the audience, but even for the rhetorician himself, in pragmatic as well as in moral terms. Thus, if the orator or one of his listeners were going to war on a mule based on misconception that it has the qualities of a horse, he would be at higher risk than someone who knows what a horse is like. However, as Socrates points out at this passage, that is 260b to d, it's even more dangerous for both the orator and his audience if they happen to have and share this kind of erroneous conception about notions such as what is just, unjust, good, bad, since their individual existences as well as their community might take an overall wrong direction. Then the good orator should not make use of the beliefs of his audience in order to persuade them, but needs, as a minimum, a right understanding about his subject matter, and above all, knowledge about the real essence of moral values in order not to inflict harm on them and also on himself. Thus, a first point of Plato's criticism of sophistic rhetoric arises from holding that according to his philosophical analysis, insofar as to ἐικός can be identified with to pisanon and to doxaston, persuasive arguments which were based on the likely cannot be part of good rhetoric, since they would only take into account what seems to be the case to most the people, instead of knowing the truth. Thus, these arguments have a serious epistemological and moral shortcomings. On the other hand, it is stated that knowledge of the truth is a necessary requirement for rhetoric to be a technique. This is the first step of the appropriation and criticism that Plato does in the Phaedrus. Now I go to the second step. Where the two meanings I refer at the beginning are combined. A second step in Plato's philosophical criticism and appropriation of ἐικός takes place through his analysis of how opposite speeches are and should be formulated. The ability to make antilogikoi logoi on any subject was also an essential element for success, either in the assembly or in private and public trials. Socrates starts by describing the employment of opposite arguments in Athenian political life as technically executed when someone makes the same things appear at one time good, at another the opposite, at one time just, but at any other time unjust. That's our first text on the screen. So now the ability of producing ta doxanta in opposite ways, especially regarding moral values such as the good and the just, is somehow included in the art of rhetoric. For his explanation of how opposite speeches are actually made and how they should be made, Plato employs two of his more crucial philosophical categories, the similar and the dissimilar. I won't read the passage because it's quite complex and will take me quite a while. I will summarize it in what I'm going to say now. So, in this sense, at 261e, rhetoric as the skill in the production of opposite speeches, which makes appear dokein, one thing in one way and the opposite, what we saw at text A here, is redescribed in text B and in the passages around it, is redescribed in terms of likening, resembling, homoion, one thing to another. More precisely, of making use of similarity, homoiotis, and dissimilarity, anomiotis, in drifts and drafts, kata smikron, so that the audience does not notice that the rhetorician is doing so, especially in the case of things which are not distinctively different, such as is the case of moral values. But if someone wishes to do this and to deceive the audience in an efficient way, without also producing self-deception, once again, that person needs first to have knowledge of the truth, which here means more specifically to get a precise understanding of the resemblance and dissimilarity of things that are. Ten homoiotata ton onton kai anamoiotata akribos diedenai. By contrast, those who are ignorant of the truth and hand appearance will be unable to make such distinctions, and so might fail in deceiving as well as in not being deceived themselves, especially if the object of discussion, such as moral values or love, is a controversial one. Later on, through a dialogue with Theseus, Socrates will say, we are in text 5, which I will pick up later again. Socrates will say that he and Phaedrus had previously agreed that to ἐικός comes about in the minds of ordinary people because of resemblance to the truth, daia homoioteta to alethus. If we read these words in the light of these previous developments, it can be said that to ἐικός can be interpreted in epistemological terms at what seems or appears to someone like, as well as in ontological terms what resembles or is like something. Thus, two different kinds of rhetoric emerge from Plato's analysis so far. On one hand, there is the traditional rhetoric, which he criticizes for being unscientific in its making of opposite arguments, inasmuch as it randomly manipulates the beliefs of the majority and unknowingly produces simulacra which are taken by the hearers and even by the rhetorician for the real things. In this case, the use of to ἐικός is condemned. On the other hand, Plato depicts a new rhetoric according to which good orators will have an adequate comprehension of what is the case and what is dissimilar to it, that is, what is like it, so that on the basis of this right understanding, they will be able to produce convincing, likely arguments which present opposite views. Here, to ἐικός is rehabilitated as far as it is subordinated to knowledge of truth. I come back to this text, to text C here, and to the point of knowledge of the truth and appropriation of the ἐικός as a rhetorical device that can be used by philosophy. The scope for the right production of something as ἐικός, and more generally for rhetoric, being a technique, is intrinsically linked for Plato then to knowledge of the truth and of what resembles it, as Socrates asserts through his imaginary dialogue with Theseus. This is the text as 5 that we have here. Theseus, we have for some time been saying that this probability, to ἐικός, comes about in the minds of ordinary people because of a resemblance to truth, diachomerioteta dualetus, and we showed only a few moments ago that in every case, it is the man who knows the truth who knows best how to discover resemblances, thus homoiotetas. As Socrates points out here, knowledge of the truth, which is needed to produce something similar to it, is not concerned with the accuracy or distortion in the report of actual fact, as might be the case with forensic rhetoric, but rather with the distinction according to forms and kinds about subject matters to be developed and the kind of soul to be addressed. That is to say, to dialectical knowledge and to psychological knowledge as well, to exercise the psychagogia. The ways of understanding dialectics in the Phaedrus are, well, we have the more straightforward, that is the collection and division, but there are other ways of understanding as well, which I will not address, but that's the way to attain the truth that is presented in the Phaedrus, as well as the direct insight of the truth that can have the philosopher, for example, of beauty itself, as it is described in the winged chariot myth. But if this is the case, if the philosopher is able, at least partly, because never completely, because the paradigm of knowledge is the God, and even the philosopher can achieve this kind of knowledge fully and directly, but at least can achieve some kind of some part of this knowledge. The question is, why would the philosopher then need to apply similarity and difference in order to produce something ἐικός, just resembling the truth, instead of providing a straightforward knowledge of the actual truth? if he has attained some kind of knowledge, why not to communicate straightforwardly that knowledge? I won't develop this because it's quite a long part of my paper. I would like to read the conclusions, but what I try to defend in my paper is that this is due to the issue's limitations, because even in the case of the philosopher, there will be a gap between his knowledge, even the highest kind of knowledge, and divine knowledge, as also Professor said before. The recipient's limitation, the audience limitation, in this case, the philosopher will need to apply psychagogic knowledge about his epistemic and psychological characteristics, and to choose the right kind of speeches according to the soul of his audience, his recipient. And also there can be limitations in the nature of the object itself, as we were speaking before. This is especially the case of the eschatological myths, where there is always a part where we cannot have knowledge of that is what the afterlife is like. Yes. But some truths that have been attained through dialectical knowledge can be included in that imaginary tale that is given by Plato in these eschatological myths. I come then to my conclusion, where I summarize some of these points as well. To sum up, in the first place, I have examined how the term ἐικός is used in its current meaning of likely, probably in the Phaedrus. I have shown that it can refer to trivial explanations, such as the endless and irrelevant intellectualization regarding traditional mythical accounts, as it is the case of the story about Orithya abductions by Boreas. Lysias' speech also works as an example of how sophistic rhetoric can argue in a likely way, an unlikely case. The Phaedrus also depicts how forensic rhetoric made use of reverse probability arguments, which often contradicted the actual facts. However, even in these cases, the ἐικότα explanations are not rejected in absolute terms. Socrates makes use of the myth of Typhon and decodes for the elevated purpose of showing the importance of self-knowledge. In addition to this, although he plays off his own dialectical account of love against Lysias' random, likely assertions about it, he also draws ex ἐικότος, according to his definition of eros, the bad consequences for the beloved one, who chooses to be intimate with a lover. Moreover, factual truths which forensic rhetoric despises. Moreover, factual truth, which forensic rhetoric despises, is actually uninteresting for Socrates, who rather cares for the essential truths, for example, about the real nature of the soul. In the second place, I have shown how Plato employs his philosophical categories in order to criticize, analyze, and reinstate this rhetorical device as a powerful tool for noble and good production of speeches, not only in the political sphere, but in any cultural activity, especially in philosophical field. A first Platonic turn of the screw takes place when Socrates identifies to ἐικός with to pithanon and to doxaston, and argues that inasmuch as speech is based on the likely, only taking into account what seems to be the case to most of the people, instead of knowing the truth, they have serious epistemological and moral shortcomings and cannot be part of good record. A second Platonic maneuver, which occurs when he bases rhetorical efficacy in the production of opposite arguments, that is, arguments about similarity, homoiotis, and dissimilarity, intending to deceive the interlocutor about the truth. And here, of course, the speakers themselves need to know the truth about the subject matter. Thus, to ἐικός is associated not only with what is credible to most people in its usual meaning of likelihood, but also with its meaning of likeness, the likeness of the resemblance to that which it resembles. Finally, insofar as the right use of this rhetorical device requires the speaker to know the truth, the Platonic appropriation and use of to ἐικός becomes dependent on the kind of knowledge at stake, a grasp of the ultimate principles of reality, or at least a comprehension of whatever the subject matter is, as well as on the audience's readiness and ability to understand the truth. Thus, if the issuer of the speech knows the truth, the knowledgeable speaker might choose not to impart the straightforward truth to the audience, but to present a likely explanation which resembles the real thing in order to persuade the auditors, and if possible, gradually lead them to a better and higher comprehension of the truth. That is what happens actually in the Phaedrus between Socrates and Phaedrus. However, on some topics, such as the afterlife of the soul, only an ἐικός account would be possible. In addition to this, inasmuch as human dialectical knowledge just resembles the full noetic knowledge of the eidetic realm, which is only available to the gods, the face-to-face dialectical exchange and the Platonic dialogues as an image of it should be considered as something ἐικός in comparison to divine wisdom in both senses, as the most likely rationale about this highest and truest kind of knowledge, and as the most resembled representation of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Fierro, for this excellent presentation. And now I give the floor to Cássio, who's going to offer a commentary to your piece. So Cássio, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pedro. Thank you, Professor Fierro, for the wonderful presentation. I want to begin by saying that I now also share in Pedro's expectation for your book. I'm sure it will be great, and I'm very anxious to be able to read the full thing. So I'd like to begin also by, of course, thanking the committee by allowing me to participate, calling me to comment, and to say that I now feel a little bit like Socrates in the symposium, where everyone gives a speech, after so many wonderful speeches, then comes Socrates and says, as we say in Portuguese, the bomb exploded in my head, now it's up to me to continue. But well, I will attempt to be brief in my commentary and fulfill my role as a commentator, just pointing to a few problems that I believe could contribute to the discussion. So let me grab my text. The theme, if I have understood correctly, you want to use this separation of a new meaning to the ἐικός as to rehabilitate or to show how Plato rehabilitates rhetorics as a separate from philosophy, perhaps subdue to philosophy, as a kind of ancile philosophia, if I've understood correctly. And I'm not fully convinced. I'll attempt to show why that is. And of course, your sense of ἐικός is that differentiating it from an idea of that which resembles truth, or what seems to be truth, and that which the philosopher constructs, the dialectician constructs to be true in order to prepare or to move forward with the discussion in those who cannot yet attain a higher degree of truth. Well, this, interestingly, very much resonates with a lot of my interests in researching Plato. In fact, in the Cratylus, it does seem to have a lot of parallels to what you have been pointing to in the Phaedrus. In fact, and I find that very interesting, that their naming itself is established as a kind of imitative art of imitation. So, and of course, naming is not supposed to be understood solely as giving nouns, right? Forming nouns. No, it's a lot more than that, as later would be shown in other dialogues, and even in the Cratylus itself, a name can contain in itself speeches, right? So naming can be a way to refer to language as a mechanism, and it is shown in the Cratylus to be a form of imitative art in which and the metaphor there is the painter, right? The painter will look to truth and to that which is the model and attempt to construct something that resembles that. So in a sense, it seems to me that Plato is pointing to language as a phenomena as a whole, in a sense, to be connected to the idea of imitating truth. And so then it comes the problem, because I think your attempt of rehabilitating rhetorics is perhaps very dependent on the idea that it itself is this which imitates truth and fulfills this role as an imitative art. And so it comes to me the question, what then differentiates rhetorical discourse from other forms of discourse? In fact, also in the Republic, poetics, of course, is pointed as an imitative art, an art of imitation. Again, in the midst of a criticism of poetics, but yet it seems, at least to me, that it isn't sufficient to talk about rhetorical discourse and to define it perhaps as that which imitates truth and moves forward the discussion in this way, because as you point yourself in your work, Socrates seems to concede that every form of discourse needs to, in order to be fulfilling, to be good, needs to imitate truth in some regard. So that's my first question, right? What exactly differentiates rhetorical imitation from other forms of discourse, if anything? Now, the second question is a problem which I think would inevitably surface once you establish that language as a whole, as a phenomena, is linked to the idea of imitating truth, which is, if the dialectician is he who knows, who holds this knowledge of truth, and he attains it by dialectical method, which itself is dependent on language, and language is dependent on contemplating the forms of the truth. And so it kind of becomes circular, because you need language to attain truth, and you need truth to work with language, at least in the best way, in a good way, as he puts it. Now, if I have understood correctly, you attempt to break, as many commentators, of course, try to use this circularity to move forward a kind of a point. Some will point to the eidetic vision, right, as a means to break the cycle, and so someone can attain the eidetic vision, at least partially, and then the whole process of discourse is rehabilitated and possible without falling into a kind of circular trap. Others will point and say, no, this is a kind of criticism of dialectical knowledge in itself, and so it can only be limited. It can never really say to attain truth. Now, I find that latter position to be very difficult to hold if you take into account Plato's work, because it does seem possible, at least to some degree, that we are able to attain some knowledge of the form, some knowledge of truth. And if I have understood it correctly, your point is exactly that we can do so by process of anamnesis, and so we can reconstruct at least a partial, if the truth knowledge is mainly to the gods, as you said it, as a paradigm. It's about what divine, right? It's for the gods, but we can attain at least a partial knowledge of truth through language and through the means of resemblance of truth. But if so, then is the same thing. My question would be then, is this partiality, our partiality of our partiality of knowledge of truth? I don't know if I said it correctly. The reason that our knowledge of truth is partial, always will be partial, is it due to language as an instrument of expressing truth, or is it due to our condition in this life, right? We cannot be as the gods. Because of course this falls into the classical interpretation of the Phaedrus as pointing to perhaps the partiality of language in itself, of speech, or at least as written speech, but perhaps it's not only the problem of written record that is partial, but language in itself. Or is it more so, is it our condition in this life that we can really never attain the fuller or complete knowledge of truth? So to make it clear, perhaps I've made it only more complicated by trying to explain it. Is it your position that does your understanding of ἐικός point in the direction that language is this limitation that will not allow us to attain the full, we are limited to the instrument of language in order to attain truth, and we can only attain a partial knowledge of truth because our instrument is itself defective, so to speak? That's all I had to.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Cássio. Well, I will try to answer because it's, as Plato would say, it's an articulated logos, what you have done. And I don't have the paper. I would like to have it then, but I try to make notes to answer. Well, as far as I understood what you are thinking, this analysis of the ἐικός that I propose in my paper is not only to rehabilitate rhetoric for philosophy. What I try to show is that Plato makes this complex transformation of the meaning of ἐικός, combining the ordinary sense with the new sense where his philosophical categories are present, for two purposes or two targets. One, to criticize traditional rhetoric. And so he can say, well, to ἐικός is to doxaston, is to pithenon, and doesn't care about the truth in the sense of the essential truth. So this criticism that always is made to Plato, that, oh, he's inventing sophistic rhetoric. Yes, that's right, but he does it for one purpose. He needs these categories in order to give a criticism according to the philosophical categories with which he intends to explain reality, knowledge, well, and all the things he speaks about. But besides that, I couldn't develop that, but it's mentioned in my paper. I think that Plato goes farther than just to say, well, I take rhetoric and use it for philosophical purposes and include it as some kind of tool to help me to lead, for example, someone like Phaedrus, who is mechanically and uncritically attached to this speech and try to move him to a better understanding of what things really are. Yes, it's not just for that it's not just that what he is doing. I agree with, for example, with Eunice, that he's creating a new rhetoric, which is philosophy. And in that new rhetoric, he includes all the devices of the traditional rhetoric, even from other literary genders, as we have in Nightingale's famous book. Yes, he uses all that in order to create this very special discourse that is Plato's philosophical discourse. He creates a new rhetoric, really, an absolute rhetoric, as Eunice says. Yes. So, and about what you say about language and what happens with language, for example, in the Cratylus, which I have been studying later on, and I was fascinated by it. I agree with your interpretation that naming is pointing to language and to logos, yes, to mean assertions, true or false assertions about the word. And in a way, it is imitative, and we also find the paradigm of the gods' language and human beings' language, yes, which is, as you say, it's defective compared with that language. But although it is true that in any expression made by anyone, Plato would say we are trying to reflect something, yes, to say something, yes, that's true. We are trying, if you want to imitate something using your own words. What he's saying is, well, I can randomly imitate without any knowledge, and so I say whatever comes to my mind, or I repeat what I read or what I heard from my neighbor or whatever, yes, or I can imitate, I can try to put into words something I have tried really to understand what it's like. And that's a major difference, especially if I try to understand what is good, what is just, yes, what is be brave, yes, as he does, for example, in the Republic, yes, where we must say, well, it's not a definite answer, but it's an answer of what is to be a wise man, to be a just man, brave man, and also a brave city, a just city, a wise, etc. So the imitation is true, it's present as in every, if you want, in every expression of language, but it can be performed in different ways. And that's the point for Plato, and why he creates all this battery of categories to explain this. Well, the problem is, as you say, how much language is necessary, how much we need to use language in order to get dialectical knowledge, because the broader meaning of dialectical method is conversation. Yes, so just with that, we have that language is necessary. We can, it is a tool. I think that's clear also in the, well, clear, I don't say clear with Plato, no, but it's suggested in the Cratylus, yes, with the, this image. Well, he says that that is a tool, yes, that is a tool. But it's a tool to get some kind of grasp where I can leave aside language. It's like to come and go. It's not something fixed. Either I grasp the forms and try to say, to put that into language, or I just use language, and in fact, I can differentiate between language and knowledge of truth. I think that there is an interaction in Plato between these two things, which is not perfect. That's right, it's not perfect. We should be like the gods to have a perfect language which reflects exactly reality, because the gods are knowing the whole eidetic realm and in an immediate way. And so they would name, I think, everything exactly, which is impossible for us. It is impossible. One of the reasons, and now I'm answering, I think, one of your last questions, is because language is defective. And we need it as a tool to think and to try to know the truth. That's one of the reasons. If we go to our psychological constitution, in the Phaedrus itself, yes, we have, we are not only rational beings. We have Timaeus, which is the white horse here. I think that here it is presented like that for didactic reasons, and because the other limitation that we have, temporal limitation. Even if I'm able to develop a full dialectical speech because I have understood whole reality, my temporal limitation as mortal human being will make unable to me to develop that and to explain it to someone. I have this situation that is so well presented in a dramatic way in the Phaedrus. Socrates has that day, that beautiful summer day with Phaedrus, to try to move him to a different kind of understanding from where he is when the dialogue starts, yes? But he has only that day. Even if he had the whole knowledge, that I think he doesn't, because in the winged meat, it is said that human souls, most of them don't reach the topos hyperuranius, and the few of them which reach it, just hardly mogis have a peep of it, yes. But even in that case, my time and the needs of my other parts of the soul, and which are connected with my body, because I'm an incarnated human being. And that's also clear in the Phaedrus, yes, I'm body and soul. At least here I'm body and soul. I can imagine some kind of reasonable speculation with imagination, as Luca was telling us, yes, about what this afterlife would be like. But here I'm an incarnated creature, yes, so I will have those limitations as well, yes. So I think that with that I have mostly answered what you don't.
Oh, thank you. Thanks a lot, and it's rich, very good discussion. And now I open the Q&A. So whoever wants to speak, just raise your virtual hands or leave a question in the chat, and we'll carry on our discussion. If everybody is shy, I'm going to begin with a question then. Yeah, and also to connect with the previous talk, Pitteloud, the Timaeus. I don't know if you have even thought to this matter, but how would you think that the meaning of the एको, the traditional meaning of एको that Plato explores so well and appropriates, as you skillfully demonstrated, is presented in the Timaeus with this idea of the एको mythos, the likely story, the likely account of the origin of and the functioning of the universe. What do you make of the एको, the status of एको that appears there in the Timaeus?
Well, thank you, Pedro. I would like to have the answer, so I will have another article. I must think more about it. I must think more about that. I can give a first answer to it. On one hand, I think we have it is the ordinary sense, but anyway, now with the epistemological charge of Plato's categories, yes. It's not scientific, as Luca was saying. I agree. It cannot be scientific. So if that's not possible, I give a likely explanation, the best explanation which is possible, according to the premises that Plato has in his philosophy. For example, that the first premise are the forms, yes, and that, well, the best explanation will be a cosmos which is organized according to this rationality, yes, etc. So in that sense, this first part of the complex meaning of ἐικός could be present. But besides that, when the myth starts, and here I have my Timaeus because I knew that question will come, when at 208 B, A, B, C, it's said that the demiurge has to look at one paradigm to create the cosmos. And he chooses the paradigm of what always is. But he has to, as Luca was telling, he has to transfer that or to translate that into the cosmos, which has the characteristic of coming to be. Yes. So there we have this Platonic category of resemblance in an ontological sense. Yes, it has to make it as much as possible similar to what it is. So it will have this, for example, this regularity in the movement of the stars and the planets. Yes, in that area of the universe where that is more possible than in the area where we live, where things change more and it's more difficult to, because it's the mortal area. Yes, but it will make it as much as possible similar to that. Yes, so I guess that the two meanings combined, because are not separate, but I had to separate them to explain what I think Plato is doing, but he doesn't need that. as with many concepts, I think, he takes the ordinary sense and transforms it and puts more things in it. Yes, and we try to separate that to understand what he's doing. But he doesn't need to do that. He just continues using the word eros, ἐικός, or whatever. Yes, he transforms the meaning. But I think that the two meanings I think that are combined in the Phaedrus for this criticism of rhetoric, and then for this appropriation of rhetoric from philosophy might be found in the Timaeus, but I should study it more.
Thank you very much.
If there is no question, I would like to take something that Luca said about the myth, which I'm interested in. When you say that it could be a thought experiment, and he said, well, it's more than that in a way, no, because many more things are happening there, and that's one of the I don't know if it's a virtue or sometimes Plato is criticized because of that, but so many concepts and things are combined in that myth and interlinked. Yes, because we have the immortality of the soul explained in one way, the tripartition of the soul, which is symbolized through the winged chariot. But for example, we find it developed in the Republic. So that could be, that kind of explanation would be possible to develop in a dialectical way, but not here. And that also is combined with reincarnation. And that is combined with a cosmological explanation, which is symbolized through the path of the chariots of the gods. And that is combined with anamnesis, especially through beauty itself, but not only because of beauty itself. It also is evocated, well, is announcing what he's going to say about dialectical method in the second part. And besides, it finishes explaining what is to fall in love, and from falling in love and be madly in love to elevate to the metaphysical realm. So all that story contains some, in fact, you know that in the 19th century it was said that it was a used work by Plato because it contains all Plato's main doctrines, yes, and because of the theme as well. But I think that in the midst, he not only the themes, these concepts appear, but they are interlinked in a sort of story. And that's something, I don't know how to describe it really, but it's, well, it's the rhetoric, the philosophical rhetoric which Plato creates.
Great, great. I studied the Phaedrus as well, and I can say that I have many points of agreement with these remarks that you just presented. And now Professor Gordon has a question, so please.
So not really a question, but just a small point that I think is really kind of a friendly comment about your paper. There's a passage in the Republic that where Plato's clearly making a little joke, but I think what it shows is the plasticity of this, of ἐικός, and how Plato is very self-conscious in how he's using it. And so it's, you know, it's at the end of book 9, it's like the umpteenth time that the boys have asked, is this possible? You know, they keep asking. And then Socrates says, you know, it's an image in heaven. And then the very last word that Glaucon utters is ἐικός, yeah, which is sort of, you know, I always read that as a kind of pun on, it's a sort of likely story itself, but yeah, he's also just saying, yeah, probably so. So anyway, just a small point that I think.
Yes, no, it's a great point, Jill. Thank you very much, because one of the things I try to indicate in my translation, which is an annotated translation, was this game of Plato with the details. Mm-hmm. And one of the many things I follow, and it is in my footnotes, then I constructed this paper, was how when the appearance of ἐικός occur in the dialogue, which are many. And so you can see how the incidental meaning, which maybe is, it seems to be a joke, as you say, is pointing to the conceptual treatment. Yeah. And that with other concepts as well. And it was very, very hard to make this translation. It took me years because it has also studies of each part, but it was fantastic to be so close to him and to understand what a complex game, as he says at the end of the Phaedrus as well, he's playing and inviting us to play with him. And that it's not just rhetoric in the sense of superficial rhetoric, these dramatic parts, these interludes, these jokes between the friends, the words he chooses. Everything is very much calculated by him, and that's fascinating. I think that's I love that. I love to be so close to that, at least with one of his works. Yes, you feel that form and content are so much close to that you can't separate one from the other, really. Well, thank you very much, Jill. And thank you very much to Cássio again for his comments.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for accepting the invitation, for giving this excellent talk. I feel that everybody is mentally exhausted.
Temporal and mortal limitations.
Exactly, so embodied condition. And so if no one has anything further to add, I think we'll finish this second table of Plato today. And just also a note on the certificates for those who are participating, who have registered and want to get a certificate for this event. You have to attend at least 80%, that is 4 tables, and then to send us an email after the event in the following week. So these 2 conditions: to attend at least 80% of the tables, those graduate students or undergraduate students who need the certificate, and then send us an email. So, but that's it, just a short note on the certificates, because some people have asked us in the email. And I'd like to thank you all. Thank you, Professor Fierro, Professor Pitteloud, Gordon, Cássio, Sam, Professor Renaud. I don't know if he's still here. It was a really rich and fruitful day, and this is just our first day of this amazing international symposium. So with this, I'll just say that Plato today continues tomorrow, and we will see each other soon at 9 a.m. with the same link. Thank you very much, everybody, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you. Great occasion.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, professors, and thanks everyone. See you tomorrow. And, yeah.
Bye.